Good morning. You're all looking kind of cozy out there. And it's really good to have you with us, both in all the ways. I'm actually going to begin with a reading, and I'm going to be honest. I'm beginning with this reading, which I don't usually do because it was just a real week, and I couldn't quite figure out how to get this into the sermon. So it's here on the outside of the sermon, but it was important. And these are the words of Adrienne Marie Brown from her book, "We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice." Knee-jerk call-outs say, those who caused harm or mess up or disagree with us cannot change and cannot belong. They must be eradicated. The bad things in the world cannot change. We must disappear the bad until there's only the good left. But one layer under that, what I hear is, we cannot change. We do not believe we can create compelling pathways from being harm doers to being healed to growing. We do not believe we can hold the complexity of a gray situation. We do not believe in our own complexity. We do not believe we can navigate conflict and struggle in principled ways. We can only handle binary thinking, good, bad, innocent, guilty, angel, abuser, black, white, etc. The words of Adrienne Marie Brown. Suitcases and I do not love one another. And I was very aware of this on the morning recently at the end of October when I got off a transatlantic flight to London and took my bags on the underground to reach a church service on the far side of the city. I had been up for many hours, and my luggage and I just weren't loving each other as I lugged it over the cobblestone streets. I had done research, and I had known not to have anything with wheels or depend on anything with wheels. However, carrying all that stuff wasn't all that much fun either. But I made it to worship. The chapel was gorgeous and centuries older than any worship space in our faith which I'd ever been in before, and there was a small smattering of people spread across the small cluster of chairs. I wasn't surprised. I've heard for many years about the decline of our faith in the UK, and the following morning I took another train and then a bus to the village of Great Hucklow, where the Unitarians had first established a home for disabled soldiers, which became a camp for children, which is still active, for kids who might otherwise never see the countryside in the scope of their days. And here I attended the meeting of the Ministerial Fellowship, the gathering of Unitarian and Free Church ministers from around the United Kingdom. They welcomed me into their circle, which was not large, as a representative from the UU Ministers Association, and as a U.S. colleague who had served among them for a number of years warned me. They wished me to be careful, not to be tempted into the refrain of, in the U.S., we do this, because the resources are so much more limited in their congregations. So I admit it. I had a story in my head about what was happening, and on the first night, my counterpart, the president of the Ministerial Fellowship, sort of rolled his eyes at me, allowing how they knew they were used as a cautionary tale in the U.S. Don't let happen to you what happened to us in the U.K. And I knew I was guilty as charged and got very quiet. For the next 2 days, I listened, and I volunteered to be the flip chart scribe so that I could listen more carefully. They were doing a planning process, and I walked every morning by the beautiful Unitarian stone chapel where services are now held for a small handful of people who gather only once a month. By the last day, when I made my report to them, I was able to aim it somewhat in areas that I had collected from their interests. And I also had a list of ideas that I had collected from their experimentations as communities centered around faith and values in a very secular culture, conditions they faced just a few decades before we did. My quiet, my decision to listen for different stories had left room for curiosity and respect, and in that space I saw that my UK colleagues were not just sitting around waiting for their demise. They were very actively, very excitedly in this planning process, working to figure out how they could best serve the needs of the people in their communities. So we know how this is, how we tell ourselves stories that limit our own lives. And in this time, I think it's particularly important that we think about this. We know how others tell stories about us, which affect how we feel. And we know that this can happen for whole groups of people, as we know in this very polarized time we're living in. Sometimes it's hard to hear another story, especially for those of us who've had to fight so hard to hear our own true voice. Some of us have worked so hard at that, and others of us feel very protective of protecting that right, especially in these times. And I remember, and many of you are remembering because you've been speaking to me about it, about what happened in 2016 when we faced somewhat similar circumstances, perhaps not as extreme, and the ways that we found ourselves in conflict with people that we loved, and the ways that we found ourselves in conflict with each other. It seems to make sense that we are wired, perhaps within our reptilian brains, to be defensive, especially when we see the other side as a threat, and increasingly we do. Since 2010, the researchers say, when the use of digital devices and social media began to increase exponentially, the divide grew very fast, especially in the area of political polarization. The Listen First Project offers a long list of disturbing numbers from a range of sources, including these. From the AP, 87% say political polarization is a threat to America. 51% from the PRRI, 51%, including 55% of independents and 85% of Democrats, say that the Republican Party has been taken over by racists. From PRRI, 44%, including 84% of Republicans and 47% of independents, say the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists. The defensiveness and fear that we have about one another is reinforced by the media business models that we now have, which make their profits by sensationalizing the news. And I think of this as the Weather Channel phenomenon. And it's been around for a while, actually. I remember going on a Christmas trip as an adult with my parents, and we were supposed to go to dinner, and they said, no, we can't go. I said, why not? We have a reservation. They said, we have to wait for the Gulf Stream report. I was like, really? Okay, so there you go. They were so convinced that they could not live without watching the Gulf Stream report. And political news now is worse in its 24-hour doses. While a truth may be involved, and that truth itself may not be bad. Some people may be very happy that the Democratic Party is embracing more socialism, for example. By the time it's amplified to give it a new twist, it becomes a cause for great paralyzing fear, which causes more fear from the other side, and then the reality begins to be diminished by the fear. And also diminished is our ability to relate to one another as people who would profit from our division wish us to be. This is a time when, like the song of Bernadette, we still want to hear that longing for deeper connection. This drama fuels anger, and then, mixed with our cultural myths, can become paralyzing. And there are other stories, too, that are out there in the stratosphere that make this all very complicated, such as the myth of American exceptionalism, in that our nation, which, by the way, is not all of America, as our neighbors on both sides will tell us, that this nation has always been a force for good and can only be a force for good. And that can make us very vulnerable when the evidence, such as that which we got last week, is so overwhelming to the contrary. We have so many of these stories that we tell ourselves, that we aren't smart enough, that we are smarter than everyone else, that we aren't good enough, or that we are the only one good enough, and so must isolate ourselves. Just like the list of things that Casey shared with us, that we have so many of these stories that bad things happen for a reason, that bad things happen because we need to be punished, that there is always a simple answer, a one-step answer to the challenges before us, that aging is a defeat, that young people who are struggling are just lazy, that having fewer economic resources is a judgment, that having more economic resources is a curse, that we are infallible, that we are the strongest democracy in the world. So many of these stories. Now, Adrienne Marie Brown points out another myth, and one she says is perhaps at the root of so many of these others, and that is our belief that we live in a world of scarcity, when in fact, she says, we live in a world of abundance. But our belief in scarcity leads to many things, one of them being what her friend Terry Marshall calls a crisis of imagination. So what do? This is a time when we cannot compromise our values, and nothing that we're talking about today about our stories has to do with compromising our core values. Yet so many are concerned about how they're going to go on, not only in the bigger frame, but also how they're going to have that holiday meal with the person who voted for the person who will be coming into office in January, and what we can do in the long term to reverse this polarization. I need to say, going back to those myths, that there is no simple single answer. Some of us may choose not to have that contact as a boundary to protect our own well-being, and others may go ahead and make it clear that what topics are off limits. Tanya Israel, who holds many identities, including being Asian, Jewish, and bisexual, works in the dreaded field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she wrote an award-winning book called Breaking Out of Our Bubble. She says she hears 4 main reasons why people don't want to talk, who want to talk to people with different views from theirs. The first is they may have a relationship they value, that they want to continue even though there are ideological differences. They may want to heal to convince the other person of their position. They may want just to close the division. They may really lack any understanding of the other perspective and really want to find out how someone could really believe this. But no matter what the reason, she said, the way to approach it is pretty much the same. It begins with the willingness to listen and what she calls intellectual humility, which involves openness, respect, flexibility, curiosity, tolerating ambiguity, and welcoming new ideas. Share your story, she says, not just stats and slogans. My friends, we have been through a lot in these last 2 weeks. And I know some of these ideas may make you bristle. They can make me bristle. When we're feeling vulnerable, we want people to do what we say when we say it. We're afraid of fear-based compromise of values. And I want to say very clearly that while I believe that we can compromise on some things, I absolutely do not believe that we can compromise on our values about the worth of all people and about how much we are interdependent with one another. We cannot compromise on protecting people's basic right to safety. Everybody deserves the safety of their story, and we will be called in the days to come to help protect that. Everybody deserves to be themselves as they are, and if that story threatens someone else, that is not the fault of the storyteller. I want to say this very strongly because I believe it with all my heart. Just as I am clear that I wish more people were still Unitarians in the UK, it doesn't mean that my way of asking for that makes sense. In our relationships, we need to be more imaginative, Adrienne Marie Brown says. I will not be perfect, I will keep learning, she says. I will also not be silent, I will keep learning. And she says we need to begin to think about a transformational justice rather than just rearranging those proverbial deck chairs on a sinking ship. Now, my UK colleagues had their own stories as well about us. And in my first 2 nights, as I sat at the tables, they were joking in a kind of sideways way about the stupidity of the US and did not hesitate to do it in front of me. And there were a few others from the US as well. They got a certain satisfaction from the story about a nation with so much arrogance that had somehow unwittingly allowed the forces of authoritarianism and anti-democracy to prevail. Yet on the second morning, I led a brief worship for them. And at the very end, as I was saying the closing words, I teared up when I asked them to hold all of us in this country in their thoughts, for the election was upcoming. And after that, they heard the story in a different way. A couple hours later, one of them came to me and asked if it would be all right if a group of them held a prayer circle for the United States and the election. And so I went and sat with them that night, listening to their wishes and their hopes, which were very heartfelt for us. And on the day of the election, when we were all in vigil here in the sanctuary, one of the young ministers from Wales, texted me a picture of their chapel with one of the small plastic votives that said UUMA that I had given to them in that service, nestled there amid the beautiful pillar candles on their very traditional chapel altar. We don't need to change our stories. We might need to tell them more. Next Saturday, some of us will read a little bit about Heather Cox Richardson's Democracy Awakening, and we'll start thinking about our historic root causes as well. We will be known by the company we keep, and we need to be strong enough to keep company with one another, no matter what comes, not by destroying each other or subjecting one another to some kind of false purity test, and also not by tolerating things that cause us harm without telling people that that is true, so that we can all keep growing and learning. Like the child Bernadette, we may have a dream that is too ethereal for this world, and yet we are the bearers of the seeds of that belief that humans can honor one another and live in a culture of abundance and mutual aid. We do not know a perfect recipe. Many of us who are not the people who are most at risk and who will be next January may need to try some things that are very bold because others of us cannot. And as Tanya Israel pointed out, just because you can have a conversation doesn't mean that it's a mandate, and not all of us should feel that we have to have all the conversations. Yet maybe some of us should. Not because we want to challenge our values or our positions, but because we want to honor them, and we want to continue to let them not be overshadowed by fears or let them be reduced to memes. If in a world in which we cannot necessarily count on legal recourse or the rule of law, what we have is imagination and the willingness to work way outside our comfort zone and to be curious about things such as why some would find it more comforting to believe that the government is controlling the weather than to believe that there are changes that we could actually help mitigate. Why is that? We should ask. We need to share our stories. Our stories matter and we matter, our values matter, and being curious and imaginative about how we express them may matter more than it ever has. To be in dialogue is not about saying that what we have worked out is wrong or right. It's about finding another path when roads such as the ones we have known so well and traveled so well to expand the recognition of the human family may not be as available to us in the future. These are the words of Adrienne Marie Brown. She says, "We live in this abundant world, and then we are told there's scarcity, and because of that scarcity, we have to fight one another. How do we get a right relationship of change that allows us to harness it towards community, towards liberation, and towards justice?" What I ask is, how do we know that those who share our public life for private gain will not get their way, which is to want us to be divided, for it is in their interest. Instead, let us be courageous and curious and bold and open to new ideas, and let that be another form of resistance.